One summer, years back, I decide I want to bring some white friends from off the res with me to go camping in a national forest. I am an experienced camper and hiker, so were most of them, so we decided to camp deep enough in the woods to not be disturbed by anyone else and camp a few miles from any campsite nearby. I brought with me my 3 white friends and 2 cousins. Now, it's worth noting when this took place, I was out of my mind high on weed, so not really in the best state of mind, but not on anything hallucinogenic. We are on day 2 of camping and I'm assigned to night watch, aka sit at the edge of camp and talk for a few hours, since there are brown bears in these woods and we aren't trying to be mauled without warning. I'm talking to a friend about music. Now at this time we are both having a friendly chat about why Michael Jackson was arguably the best artist to come out of the 80s, and my dear friend doesn't agree with this statement because he's a whiny bitch. Anyways, back to the story. I get the need to piss, so I excuse myself while calling him a punk-ass bitch. I find a tree just outside camp while sort of singing/whistling to the tune of Beat It, half in my head half out loud. It takes me about a second, but I catch myself whistling, and if you know anything about anything, you know I just did a bad thing. I hear a crunch a few feet away, deciding I don't need to piss anymore and go back to camp like everything's kosher. Everything was not kosher. Eventually I chill out and go to bed. At what was likely 4 a.m. I wake up to heavy footsteps. I instinctively assumed this was a bear, so I'm trying to plan how I am gonna get to my bag with the bear spray while being quiet. Again, I'm high as a kite, so not very smart at the moment. That's when I notice something. The footsteps have completely stopped. They didn't wander away or anything, they just stopped. Now at this point I'm shitting bricks since I think I'm about to be mauled. That's when I start hearing whispering. At first I thought it was my friends in the other tents, but as I listened closer, I realized the whispering was right outside of my tent. I glanced at the embers of our campfire, which at this point were just bright enough to pierce the tent fabric, and for my own sake I won't be describing the shape of who was outside of my tent. Now that I'm realizing what exactly is going on, I lay back down and stay awake until morning, listening to the whispers. Once my friends wake up at dawn, they get me out to inspect the tracks around the periphery of the camp. The tracks are that of a deer, but there are only 2 prints at a time. As cliché as that sounds, that's a common story for a reason. The deer didn't go into the camp, instead walking on the boundary of it. However, the tracks didn't lead out or in, they just seemingly appeared. We tried to track it with no luck. At this point I'm pretty shaken, but nonetheless we make it through the rest of the trip with no more incidents. Though I must admit my memory is rather spotty for the rest of the trip. Once I returned home I got pretty violently ill for a couple weeks, something my family put down to a bad cold cough from the trip, which is plausible. Although a common belief in my culture is that interacting with evil spirits leads to sickness and death, and that's what I personally believe. My dad told me this story from the time he was a child. One year at a powwow on the reservation my dad is getting up to stupid shit as all native children are known to do, exploring the woods with his cousins, etc., nothing out of the ordinary. He just gets up to weird bullshit and eventually tires out around nightfall. We aren't supposed to be in the woods without a source of light. He decides to leave with his cousins, and as they are crossing the periphery of the powwow grounds, his cousin screams at him to run, and my dad being a scared small child and the cousin being older, he fucking bolts it. Once they make it to the safety of the camps, they turn around to see a pretty odd sight. This one is confirmed by my grandfather, since he also saw it. There, standing, at the periphery of the campgrounds, were 4 owls, just barely away from the light. One problem being, these owls were the size of a fully grown man. They stare for about 30 seconds, before returning into the forest, keeping eye contact with my dad and my dad only. In my culture, you are never to look an owl directly in the eyes, and boy my dad sure fucking did. The owls didn't fly away mind you, nor did they walk, they just slid across the ground backwards, until they disappeared in the forest brush. My father was smoked off, a cleansing ritual, and then sent home. Owls are omens of death here, and around the time my dad saw the owls, an old man had died in the camp. His death attracted the evil spirits who came to the camp in the shape of owls. If it wasn't for the medicine used to bless my father, I imagine he would have shared the old man's fate. Now, as you likely know, the drum is a vital part of native cultures across the Americas. Its purpose is to unite and allow man to follow the beat of Mother Earth. It's used in our songs, our dances, and our stories. Without the drum we'd be the same as anyone else. If there's something that makes us unique, it's our drums. My father went on frequent camping trips with the family as a boy in the 70s. This story takes place on one such occasion. Our grandfather had found a decent plot of land not currently used by anyone on the res and decided to set up camp. They held a nice camp dinner and had a pretty good time. Late into the night, the family was awoken. They could all hear it, a quiet drumming, not so much in any particular place, but in every direction. They could plug their ears and they'd still hear it. The drumming was something not of physical origin. My grandfather shushed the family and they sat in silence in the share tent waiting for what would happen next. Sometime later though, he said it felt like hours though it was likely minutes, the drums stopped. My grandfather never fully explained what had happened that night, but my dad believes they heard the last war song of many dead Indians as the region they camped at was near the site of a particular battle in 1875. A failed ambush not written down, which left many dead on both sides. My dad believes he heard them in their last moment of respite before their charge. My grandfather was a Marine during the Vietnam War who enlisted in 1966. He fought in many battles during the war, including the Tet Offensive, and suffered from it for years, which ultimately led to his death. Needless to say, war changed him fundamentally. He was not a man easily disturbed. My grandfather was shaken by the things he did and the things the Viet Cong did to him. One year, a few years before his death, he spoke about one such unexplained experience. He and his unit were deep in the rainforest on an assignment he hasn't spoken about as far as I'm aware. Though, on this particular trip they had come across what might have been a refugee camp at one point. A camp of what was likely women and children with a surplus of medical equipment and vehicles. The thing was, everyone in the camp was dead. Their bodies scattered about the camp. This obviously horrified the troops and they went to inspect and look for wounded. The issue here being that there weren't any rifle shell casings or bullet holes, except for those fired by a few armed personnel in the camp. The injuries sustained by the dead were primarily blunt force trauma and a few disembowelments and cuts. Heads were bashed in with rocks and intestines torn out, arms and legs ripped off, you get the picture. My grandpa was shaken and didn't like describing this, so this is all we really could get out of him. My grandpa's CO contacted command for reinforcements and field medics and soon the place was swarming with men. My grandpa later described being thrown out of the camp by suits from Washington who flooded the area within days and ordered almost every soldier out of the whole zone, which is ridiculous because this area had a ginormous Viet Cong presence. Now, here's where it gets really weird. A common story from Vietnam is that of great apes that were known to be occasionally sighted in the jungle. Which is very odd since there are no known species of ape in Vietnam. These apes were known to attack soldiers with rocks and sticks, and something the men in my grandpa's unit believed is that these apes had attacked this village en masse. Not impossible as there were only maybe 150 people there, 95% of which were women and children. Either way, a few weeks later my grandpa returned to the area with his unit and happened to return to the site of the camp to find it abandoned with all the houses burned to the ground and all the bodies and blood scrubbed clean. My grandpa's unit was forced to sign documents for their silence when they returned home, which he followed until he was near death. I'm glad he told me and I've deemed it important to inform you about this as well. These are by far the most famous creatures of the night in Navajo myth, although they exist outside of it by different names. They are men of magic, medicine men who seek power and wealth over the wellness of their people and are the most evil spirits to walk the plain. It's said they roam the West, and stories relating to them are as common as blades of grass, yet none if ever have any wealth to them. My cousin and my grandfather have two such stories about them. One night in the 90s, my cousin was working as a cab driver. She sees an old native woman sitting on a bench on the outskirts of a town and offers her a ride. The woman obliges and climbs inside. She asks to be taken into a nearby river and promises to pay well, all in fluent Cheyenne. My cousin attempts conversation, but stops as she feels uncomfortable even speaking to the woman. They drive in silence for some time until the woman begins repeatedly slamming the car door, smashing it, and my cousin slams the brakes. She looked into the mirror to ask what the fuck is this bitch's problem. That's when she's greeted with the face of a coyote. She screams and the woman opens the door and practically slithers out the door almost like a snake, and enters the tall grass nothing like a human should. My cousin drove home and tried to OD on pills a few days later. She was an addict at the time, but this experience that caused her to attempt suicide brought her back and helped her recover, meaning that in a way the shapeshifter helped her. I won't speak on this subject any longer. During the powwow season, a common story among all tribes is that of the deer woman. She's mostly played for laughs nowadays, but that was not always so. It varies, but usually she is a woman with the upper torso of a woman and the lower body of a deer, hooves and all, and is said to lure lustful and adulterous men into the woods where she takes them and kills them. She is also said to take children. In 1989, 2 children were taken the same night she was spotted standing in the open prairie by an elder. A search party was formed and they were sent into the prairie to find the children. They never did, only bits of fabric from a child's shirt. The mother killed herself weeks later and their remains have never been found. South Dakota is the home of my tribe's religion and where men of the warrior societies often travel to for spiritual journeys, amongst other reasons. My father once embarked on such a journey by himself for 3 days. He did not eat anything or move much throughout the course of the fast, at a place that could be referred to as a holy ground of my religion. He told about hearing numerous voices, many of his ancestors which he could recognize, some of which he couldn't. They spoke languages from Cheyenne to Sioux, as well as several others which he did not understand and were too numerous to count. He spoke of the sounds of war drums accompanied by screams, as well as blasts from what sounded like muskets and explosives. At one point, he recalled seeing bison charging through the wind, and told of his ancestors giving him advice and instructions. My grandfather was an important official in my tribe and one year was asked to go to the Great Navajo Nation to speak about business opportunities that went nowhere because the Navajo are flaky and would rather build more gas stations than half commit to an intertribal casino. While he was there he was invited to a Navajo ceremony, which I know nothing about since it is a Navajo ceremony and we tend to keep details about such things only inside the tribe. Thinking about it now, the fact he wasn't Navajo might actually be why this happened in the first place. A Navajo might have taken offensive to an outsider witnessing a sacred ceremony and cursed him. That and our tribes haven't always had a great relationship. My grandfather was returning home and had a stop in Amarillo, Texas. Which is a crime in and of itself, but I digress. He found a cheap motel and stayed the night. Horrible idea, who willingly stays in Amarillo? He was woken up at around 1 a.m. rather suddenly by rapid knocks of increasing intensity. He went to the door to look out the peephole to find it completely covered, realizing pretty quickly he was being attacked by something malicious. He put a desk in front of the door and attempted to call room service, but the line was cut, so was the electricity. He was in the dark, alone. From the other side of the door he heard a garbled voice, describing it as something not human, trying to sound human. It sounded vaguely like my grandmother asking him to open the door and let her in. It was repeating it and scratching the door pleading, practically begging, and wriggling the doorknob. My grandfather figured out what was happening at that point. He quickly blesses the room with his medicine, taking it with him everywhere and watches the door and windows till the morning. At one point it was slamming the window repeatedly, but it somehow held out. Hood windows are indestructible I guess, and at first light it was gone. He left and when he went outside to inspect the damage, he found claw marks across the door and scratches on the window as well as the doorknob being completely broken off. Shortly after that he left the scene before the motel noticed the trash drawer and didn't stop driving till he got out of the state. He noticed that for about 80 miles after leaving Amarillo, there was a coyote following him. He never saw it physically run but anytime he checked the rear view he would see it standing on the prairie beside the road, watching him. He never returned to Amarillo until his death. In case you were wondering, it was a Hamilton Inn just off the main road through Amarillo. Skinwalker or a crackhead, I'll let you decide.